This week on Vatican Connections, a group of 8 is appointed to help reform the Vatican. The Doctrinal congregation meets with the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. And we look at what lies ahead for a church led by Pope Francis. Hello and welcome to Vatican Connections. Now, Saturday is supposed to be a day of rest, but the journalists didn't get any time off this weekend. The Holy See announced that Pope Francis has put together a panel of cardinals from around the world to advise him on making changes to the Curia. 8 cardinals and 1 bishop make up the panel. The 8 cardinals come from different parts of the world, and almost all of them lead or have led dioceses. Only 1 Italian is on the panel, and Cardinal Oscar Rodriguez Maradiaga of Honduras is the coordinator of the group. Now, the other members of the panel are Cardinal Giuseppe Bertello, president of Vatican's City-State Governorate, Cardinal Fransisco Errazuriz Ossa, Archbishop Emeritus of Santiago, Chile, Cardinal Oswald Gracias, the current Archbishop of Bombay, India, Cardinal Reinhard Marx of Munich and Freising, and Cardinal Laurent Monswengo Pasinya, the Archbishop of Kinshasa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston is on the panel, along with Cardinal George Pell of Sydney, Australia, and Bishop Marcello Semeraro of Albano, Italy. Now, he will serve as the secretary for the group. According to the press release put out by the Holy See, the idea to put together an advisory panel was one of the topics that was discussed during the General Congregation meetings just before the conclave. Cardinal George Pell of Sydney, Australia, spoke to Catholic News Service about this and about being appointed to this advisory panel.
Well, we have the papacy and we have the College of Bishops, which is the successors of the apostles, always with and under Peter. So there's and the Second Vatican Council developed the idea of collegiality as a complement to the Vatican I explanation of the papacy. So for many years, since the Second Vatican Council, there have been international bishops on the curial bodies, and this is a further development of that. It's difficult if the Pope is isolated, and with this informal group of advisors around the Pope, we're not quite sure what he will want to talk about, but when we hear that, he will ask us for our opinions. The role of the group is not primarily about the reform of the Roman Curia. The first role is to advise the Pope on the life of the Church. He is particularly pointed to the role of the Curia. Now, I don't think it's my function at this particular point to be explaining how I think that should be done, but it's not good when the butler is photocopying and distributing 6,000 pages of private correspondence. So when there's a lot of leaking. So very fundamental things like that. The morale and discipline of the Curia needs to be addressed. Obviously in a couple of areas we'll have to look at, the whole area of finance, but also I think there's room for further developments in our relationship, the Holy See's relationship with the press. I think they've made great strides, but there's a possibility that more could be done. Right through the Middle Ages, the popes have had their advisors, sometimes called them consistories. It's a little bit like what is sometimes described in the English-speaking world as a kitchen cabinet. trusted advisors getting together for breakfast. Now, I don't think we'll be doing that. We're advisors to the Pope. We're not a cabinet. The Holy Father doesn't answer to us. And what is enormously important in this is that the prerogatives of the successor of Peter are preserved. And please God, with this regular input on top of the input from the curial officers, it will help him the Holy Father to better lead the Church. And I think there's undoubtedly another possibility is that there will be more people from around the world in the senior positions in the Curia.
There has been much talk this week about the potential curial changes that are coming our way and the panel that will advise the Pope on those changes. Francis Rocca of CNS looks at the history of curial changes at the Vatican.
In the archives of the Catholic News Service Bureau in Rome, there's a thick file folder labeled Curial Reform, full of notes and clippings that date back to the 1950s, which gives you some idea of the long and often frustrating history behind Pope Francis's current efforts to make the Vatican bureaucracy more effective and responsible. In some ways, the Pope's naming of an international panel of cardinals to advise him on reforming governance of the Church is nothing new. Popes Paul VI and John Paul II both tapped groups of cardinals for that purpose. And for more than 30 years, a permanent council of cardinals from dioceses on 5 continents has provided a degree of outside oversight over Vatican management and finances. What's striking about the group of men Pope Francis has picked is, on the one hand, the high numbers of English and Spanish speakers and of people from the Americas, which reflect the demographic reality of the Church today. Probably even more significant is the speed with which Francis is acting. John Paul took 10 years after his election to reorganize the Vatican bureaucracy, and even at the time, many concluded that he hadn't gone far enough. Francis announced his effort 1 month after his election, and given that he's 18 years older than John Paul was when he took office, it seems likely that change will come a lot more quickly this time around.
On Monday, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith met with the heads of the Leadership Conference of Women Religious. During the meeting, Archbishop Gerhard Müller thanked the group for their contribution to the Church in the United States and spoke about what the Second Vatican Council says about the mission of religious to promote church unity. Then he said he has spoken to Pope Francis about the doctrinal assessment that was issued to the group. He said Pope Francis reaffirmed the findings of the assessment and the reform program prescribed for the group. The LCWR issued a statement after the meeting. They said that the LCWR officers reviewed the activities of the past year since they have received the doctrinal assessment. They said the conversation with the head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith was open and frank, and they pray the conversations with the CDF will bear fruit for the good of the Church. We've mentioned a few times that Pope Francis has taken to celebrating daily Mass in the chapel of the Domus Sancta Marta, where he has chosen to live instead of the papal apartments. Each morning he celebrates Mass with a different group of Vatican employees and has different concelebrants. Catholic News Service spoke to Archbishop Jose Gomez of Los Angeles, who had the chance to celebrate daily Mass with Pope Francis recently.
We had a group of pilgrims coming from the United States for the meeting of the Catholic Association of Latino Leaders. And I sent the request to see if we can attend the Mass of the Holy Father, and I was invited to celebrate with the Holy Father, so it was an extraordinary blessing for me just to be able to be with him in the celebration of Holy Mass. It's a very normal, private, simple Mass. The Mass is never simple, but it was just an ordinary private Mass of the Holy Father at Casa Santa Marta, where he lives. And he gave a beautiful homily on the Feast of the Annunciation, talking about the humility of our Blessed Mother, who received the call to be the Mother of God, and also the humility of God coming to earth. Jesus Christ, who is God, perfect God, assuming a human nature and coming to earth to be with us. So it was a beautiful, beautiful moment for my ministry as an archbishop in the Archdiocese of Los Angeles.
April 16th was the birthday of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, and at the morning mass in the Santa Marta Chapel, Pope Francis told Vatican employees, "Today is the birthday of Benedict XVI. Let us offer mass for him." Then, later in the day, Pope Francis phoned Pope Benedict to wish him a happy birthday and to convey his greetings and best wishes to Monsignor Georg Ratzinger, Pope Benedict's brother. Both Georg Ratzinger and Pope Francis will celebrate their name day on April 23rd. Pope Francis's given name is Jorge, which is the Spanish version of George. Finally, Pope Francis sent messages in response to the two tragic events in the United States this week. On Thursday, after the explosion at a factory in Texas, he tweeted the following message: "Please join me in praying for the victims of the explosion in Texas and their families." On Tuesday, he had the Secretary of State send a telegram to Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston, saying he was deeply grieved by the events, and he prays that Bostonians will be united in their resolve to not be overcome by evil, but to combat evil with good. Did you know the Roman Curia has been reformed several times in its history? Popes Leo X, Pius VII, Paul VI, and John Paul II are some of the popes who made significant changes to parts of the Roman Curia. Over the last couple of weeks, we've been bringing you installments of our conversation with Father Thomas Rosica and Sebastian Gomes, who were working with the Holy See during the papal transition. This week, we bring you the third and final installment of that conversation, where we spoke about what lies ahead for the Church with Pope Francis at the helm. What should we not be surprised to see coming up?
I do not think that these small T changes that we're seeing are simple photo opportunities or little appetizers to incite the press or to get some good media coverage. I think each of these is a timed released capsule of things that are going to happen on a much greater scale. First and foremost, Pope Francis is giving some very strong lessons to priests, to bishops, and cardinals. If you are called to those offices of priest, bishop, cardinal, ordained ministry in any form, you are called first and foremost to be a servant that embodies and models gospel simplicity. So the first shock is going to be felt at that level. And it's never easy to accept that when we've grown accustomed to certain ways of living. Secondly, it's an invitation to lay people, to religious, to all of those who are not in ordained ministry, to take seriously the gospel. And thirdly, some of these time-release capsules that may seem nice now, signing somebody's cast, or holding and kissing babies, or reaching out widely and madly to people, is an invitation to those who may have misinterpreted, I say misinterpreted, something that Cardinal Ratzinger held deeply in 1977 in a famous interview that he gave, in Salt of the Earth it was called. And people have misquoted repeatedly that what is required is a small church, almost a church of the pure, a church of the elect. We don't want the masses. We don't want any of that. We want a small group. And by having that reductionist view of Christianity, we completely forget John Paul II's massive outreach, Ducem Altum, set out into the deep, go away from the shores and the familiar places, reach out to those uncharted places, those untouched areas. And I think Pope Francis is telling us right now that that's the direction of the church. That's the new evangelization. New evangelization means getting our hands and feet dirty and going to places that are very uncomfortable. I don't mind that.
Sebastian?
Yeah, very much. I agree completely with what Father Tom said. I think, too, we'll see a real attempt to implement the Second Vatican Council at the grassroots level, which is such an important thing for the Church to do at this particular moment. We're in that time, 50 years later, where a lot of people are asking questions about the Second Vatican Council. What happened over the last 50 years? Where do we need to go from here? John Paul II, because of his long pontificate, did some wonderful things to implement the council, and then Pope Benedict to clarify what continuity with the tradition meant. But here we see some elements already in Pope Francis that I expect to go a little bit deeper and to be developed further. One, collegiality, which was so clear in the first week of his pontificate. I already mentioned he emphasized the fact that he's first and foremost the Bishop of Rome. He's not this monarchical leader that sits on the throne disconnected from everybody up at the top. And then we heard him speak to the Cardinals, and he says, you, my brother Cardinals, naming them one at a time, speaking to them very practically about their collective role. And then as well, the decision, for example, to live in Santa Marta instead of the Apostolic Palace for the temporary time, or I don't know how long he's going to be there. Nobody knows really, but the reason for that was because he wanted to be in community. He wanted to be present with the people who were visiting Rome, specifically the bishops who are coming from all over the world, who are there to meet with him. So he's putting this strong emphasis on, look, I am a bishop, I am the first among equals, but I am one of you. And we need to do a lot of work in order to do what Father Tom said, which is really get behind the new evangelization, throw out into the deep. It'll be very interesting to see what his teachings look like on the Second Vatican Council and some of these elements that bore so much fruit in the 1960s, like collegiality.
Okay, just to close off, I want to ask, everyone saw that moment on television when the media department was introduced to Pope Francis at that audience with the journalists, and we saw, when you got up there, that he opened his arms and he seemed to be saying, what happened? What was going on there?
I was okay through the audience. We were told, Father Lombardi told me that I would be meeting him, and with Father Jill, my colleague, the three of us known as the Trinity, who ran all that stuff for the month. I was pretty much composed watching those who went ahead of me up the stairs, and I went up the stairs, and Father Lombardi was there on the left, and Archbishop Chaley. And when Pope Francis saw me, everyone laughed because the story was out that we had been in the street a couple days before, and I said, okay, Lord, I don't want to lose it, just do this. And there was this wonderful greeting. He said, guarda, look at me. Look what happened. And I said, we embraced, and I said, I told you. And there was some nice words that were exchanged. It was a wonderful, wonderful moment. I've had moments with popes. There was never a moment like this. When I came back to my seat, the woman sitting in front of me had worked with Cardinal Bergoglio in Argentina. She had met him just before me. She gave him the mate, and the Argentinian drink, and she was sobbing. And I started sobbing myself, and both of us embraced. And she said, wonderful lady, she had known me from media work, and she said, what a gift. Yeah. But it was a wonderful, wonderful moment.
Time to see what Pope Francis has been up to this week other than creating new advisory panels. He celebrated Mass at St. Paul outside the walls on Sunday. During his homily, he said the credibility of Christians is undermined by pastors and faithful who preach one thing but do another. He told the congregation, people must be able to see in our actions what they hear from our lips. He said the testimony of faith comes in many forms, even the hidden witness of those who live their faith with simplicity in everyday family relationships, work relationships, and friendships. He said worship doesn't mean praying, it means demonstrating with one's life that God is God. Just before the Mass, Pope Francis walked down to St. Paul's tomb under the main altar and blessed the area. And after the Mass, he visited the Basilica's chapel, which is home to a 13th century icon of the Madonna and Child. St. Ignatius of Loyola and his companions made their first vows as religious in this chapel. Wednesday, Pope Francis held his weekly general audience, and during his catechesis, he said Jesus is our advocate. He defends us from ourselves and our sins. He told the faithful not to be afraid to turn to Jesus, whether it's for mercy and forgiveness or to ask to be defended. Speaking about the ascension, he said Jesus is like a roped guide who climbs a mountain. When he reaches the summit, he pulls us up. This is true even when we can't see it happening. With Christ, when Christ ascended into heaven, he didn't go away. Instead, he is still among us, but in a new way, so that we can be certain that we are never alone. At the end of the audience, he also prayed for the victims of the earthquake in Pakistan and Iran. The Holy Father also had many one-on-one meetings with various political and church leaders. The President of Spain, Mariano Rajoy, visited the Holy Father. They discussed the difficult economic situation in Spain. They spoke privately for about 20 minutes, without translators, of course. After the private meeting, President Rajoy gave the Pope a copy of the book De Actetibus Mundi Imaginis and a soccer jersey from the Spanish national team signed by all the players. The Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, Fuad Tual, met with the Holy Father along with some bishops from the Patriarchate. Greek Melkite Patriarch Gregorios Lahm III visited the Holy Father. The Syrian Patriarch of Antioch, Ignace Yunan, met with the Holy Father, and Pope Francis accepted the credentials of the new Portuguese ambassador to the Holy See. It's time to take a look at whose resignation has been accepted this week and who's been appointed to a new job. Bishop Giuseppe Nazzaro retired. He was the apostolic vicar of Aleppo, Syria. Father George Abu Khazen takes over as apostolic vicar. Now, technically, the see of Aleppo is vacant. There is no bishop. Instead, an apostolic vicar is appointed. There are 2 new Maronite bishops, or eparchs, one in Sydney, Australia, and one in Buenos Aires. In Sydney, Maronite Bishop Ad Abikaram resigned, and Father Antoine Tarabé has been appointed to succeed him. In Buenos Aires, Bishop Charbel Georges Marie resigned, and Father Habib Kame will become bishop. And last but not least, Grand Rapids has a new bishop. Father David Walkawak has been appointed to succeed Bishop Walter Hurley, who resigned after having reached the mandatory age limit for retirement. Now, this is the part of the program where we answer your questions about how things work at the Vatican or what's been happening. This week, several viewers wanted to know what the Pope has said about different topics related to the basics of our faith. So this week, let's take a look at what Pope Francis has said about confession. Now, his first 7 homilies all focused heavily on God's mercy and forgiveness, and even his private comments focused on this. On Holy Thursday, he had lunch with a group of priests from Rome who work with the poor, and he told them, "Open the doors of the church, and then the people will come in. If you keep the light on in the confessional and you are available, then you will see what kind of a line there is." This came on the heels of a week of homilies about God's mercy and forgiveness, in which Pope Francis said it's not God who tires of forgiving, but us who get tired of asking for forgiveness. But we should not tire of turning back to God and telling him we've messed up and we're sorry. Pope Francis's words have not gone unheeded. Now, as Cardinal of Buenos Aires, he would often go himself to parishes where there weren't enough priests and hear confessions while the pastor took care of other things that needed his attention, whether it was saying Mass or making sick calls. According to the Italian newspaper La Stampa and the noted Vaticanist Andrea Tornielli, priests around the world have been reporting a marked increase in the numbers of people coming in for confession in the last month. Tornielli calls this the Bergoglio effect. Vatican Connections is interactive. Send us your questions or comments by Facebook, Twitter, email, or post. Via email, send comments to info@saltandlighttv.org. And by post, send letters to 114 Richmond Street East, Toronto, Ontario, M5C 1P1, Canada. After giving journalists something to report on Saturday, Pope Francis then celebrated Mass on Sunday at the Basilica of St. Paul's outside the walls. The basilica is built over the tomb of St. Paul the Apostle and is one of the 4 major basilicas of Rome. Traditionally, the Bishop of Rome visits and celebrates Mass at each of the 4 major basilicas shortly after being elected. Catholic News Service has art historian Elizabeth Lev explaining why the basilica is a powerful sign of unity.
Of the 4 papal basilicas, St. Paul's Outside the Walls represents the unity of the church. I find, again, with a theme that helps understand the decoration, the rebuilding in particular. This church is one that has been really rebuilt from the ground up on more than one occasion. Now, I mean, St. Peter's had its big rebuild in the 16th century, but this church, it has been taken down and rebuilt more than once. And it I think, moves a lot around the figure and the person of St. Paul and his role in uniting the church. One of the great characteristics of the Romanesque, which is very much like Paul's teachings themselves, is that the Romanesque gives you a sense of a solid core, a stability, but then it allows for endless variation of the imagination. So that idea of how each person, the gospel is what it is. It's our stable, it's our rock, it's our foundation, it's what we are. But how each person lives the gospel, how each saint expresses his cooperation with God's grace, each one is its own unique work of art. And the Romanesque really has a tremendous capacity of transmitting that concept, and it's all born out of these 2 centers. And all of that beauty, all of that work, all of the decoration went up quite literally in smoke on July 15th of 1823, when a fire broke out during just some regular work. It's hot in July, people were working up, they needed embers to light the area. The ember wasn't put out right, it was sitting on top of a wood timbered roof, and the church went up in smoke. As a matter of fact, there's a very kind of touching engraving, because a lot of people went out. The fire went on for 2 days. A lot of people went out to see it. There's a very moving engraving where you see the fire department, the 1823 fire department, with a little cart and with these little buckets on the cart coming up from the river. And you just see the towering inferno of the church, and you realize the church never stood a chance. And so Pius VII was dying that night, as a matter of fact. Pius VII, who had weathered the entire Napoleonic storm, he dies. And they don't have the heart to tell him about St. Paul's Outside the Walls, but it meant his successor immediately would have to deal with the problem of rebuilding St. Paul's. And here's the situation. This is after the French Revolution. This is after the Enlightenment. This is after this huge secularist wave that has spread throughout Europe. Half of Europe is Protestant. The rest don't seem to care about religion at all. Who on earth is going to be interested in rebuilding this ancient church that belonged, this ancient papal basilica? And yet, Leo XII put out an appeal, which was then repeated by Gregory XVI. The entire Catholic world responded, gathering together what was 400,000 scudi, which is a ton of money, to be able to rebuild this church. It drew the church together again. But the best part is, it didn't just draw the Catholics together. The entire Christian world contributed, and even non-Christians contributed. So when you walk into the church, you have these beautiful alabaster columns framing the main doors, a gift from Muhammad Ali of Egypt, the alabaster in the windows, Fuad I from Egypt, the malachite altars in the transept, a gift from Tsar Nicholas of Russia. So literally the entire world, again, the sense of unity, everybody contributing, everybody being part of the legacy of unity that St. Paul gave us.
And that's all for this week's edition of Vatican Connections. Join us next week when, among other things, Pope Francis celebrates his name day. From everyone here, thanks for watching.